Good morning or afternoon or evening to everybody, depending on which part of the world you're in. I'm Eric Smith. I'm the president and CEO of Tree Fund. We're a 501c3 U.S. nonprofit that was established 10 years ago this year, jointly by ISA and TCIA, to support the discovery and mission of research that has relevance and importance to arboriculture and the urban forestry trades and practices and professions. I wanted during that 15-year span, we've issued about $3 million in grants. A few $100,000 of that has been for educational partnerships, but the lion's share of what we do is to fund research. So we've put out about $3 million in research grants over the years, and we award globally. Start in the United States, but about 15% of our grants over the years have been awarded to researchers outside the company, including Dr. Andrew Hirons, who's going to be speaking with you here shortly. I'd mentioned right at the beginning there that what we're about is the discovery and dissemination research findings, ability to those of you in the. And I wanted to just quickly, I'm going to share my screen here, which is going to take you to the Tree Fund website. So hopefully you can hear me and see the screen. I think because we're breaking the internet with so many of you all, I'm getting a little bit of snag. There we go. A core to disseminating the research that we put out, webinars are a part of that. We also heavily use our website as a place to go, as a clearinghouse and a single source of reference and research for all the work that we've done over the years. It's treefund.org if you'd like to bookmark that. All of the webinars that we do 4 over the course of the year, are easily looked here. The one thing I just wanted to show folks that I don't know that everybody who is familiar with us and those who aren't familiar with us clearly don't know is about the research archive that we actually have on the website here. If you have a particular research question, there are references here to all of our, and again, it's running a little bit slow. You can actually search by topic down in this area, or by specific keywords up in this area. I'm just going to pick randomly and show you what's out there. But for all of the research grants that we have awarded over the years, there's a full matrix here that will show when they were awarded, who the awardees are, including today's presenter, where they're from, and a project title over here that will give you the information that you need. And as you go back, one of the things that we all know, at least on our side, on the research side about tree research, is because trees are long-lived organisms, tree research oftentimes takes a long time. And then in the academic world, the publication cycle can take a long time. So from the time that we award to the time that there may be published documentation, but again, I'm just going to I'll pick another UK one here. But for all of these research topics, when you click on these project titles, you'll get a page that will give you a summary of what the research was. And if we do have access to public publications that are out and about, links will be here as well. We are all at Tree Fund very accessible to you. If you have a specific question that comes up, you can contact us here by the website, and we may be able to also help direct you to where you might be able to get answers to the questions that you have. So we appreciate you joining us for the webinar today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And at this point, I would like to introduce our speaker for the day. Dr. Andrew Hirons is a senior lecturer in arboriculture at University Centre, Myerscough, UK. He began his career as a climbing arborist and plant healthcare technician, gaining experience in Australia, America, and the UK before joining the arboriculture department at University Centre, Myerscough in 2004. He teaches on the full-time and online higher education courses, delivering modules related to tree biology and tree management. And his current research activity is motivated by the need to create resilience in our urban forests, and is focused on using plant traits to inform species selection for urban environments. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Andrew Hirons.
Okay, can you hear me now? Is that okay? Great. Okay, well, let's get started. Thanks so much to Mark, Megan, and Eric for the introductions. And let me just start by thanking Tree Fund for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on drought tolerance in trees, and of course, some of the research findings from the Tree Fund research sponsorship. So, as I say, my name's Dr. Andy Hirons. We'll get straight into the seminar and see how we go. We'll be pausing throughout for questions, but there'll also be, I hope, plenty of opportunity for questions at the end of the seminar. So we'll see how we go, and let's hope we can all stay with it. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I thought I'd better just start by reminding everybody, in case we'd forgotten, that trees need water. In fact, all plants need water, and they're largely made up of water. The non-woody plant parts are made up of about 70 to 95% water, and even wood is about 50% water, and it's important for cellular structure. We see that in the turgor pressure, a substrate for biological activity, for example, the photosynthesis, and a solvent for gases, minerals, growth regulators, and all sorts of other things being moved around the tree. And it's fundamental for nutrient acquisition. So, of course, water is important, yet rather interestingly, only about 1 to 5% of water is actually taken up and retained as biomass. The rest of the water is lost through this process of cohesion, tension, and the driving the uptake of water. We're not going to dwell too much on that process, but I thought it would be an interesting place to start and to try and just think about how much water landscape trees use. And it's a really important question if we're looking to maintain urban landscapes. One of the pieces of work that I think is particularly relevant and interesting in this regard is Richard Beson's work based at the University of Florida, and he developed a really nice system, a tree lysimeter, but really what it is, it's a load cell which he could grow rather large containerized trees on, and with that load cell he could then monitor the loss of water from that root ball, if you like. And just picking out a couple of the species that he looked at. Here, if we look at the top left figure there, Acer rubrum, so red maple, you can see the early part of the year, before the leaves come out, there's only about 10 litres of water moving through that tree per day, something in that order. But then as soon as the leaves expand and develop, within the space of a few weeks, we see that evapotranspiration goes up to somewhere between 100 and 120 litres per day, depending on the weather conditions on that day. Now, this is in Florida, so we wouldn't expect those sorts of volumes of water to be shifted through red maples in every climate, but that just gives you an idea of the sorts of volumes relatively modest sized landscape trees can go through. And just the other species there, Ulmus parvifolia, again, that's peaking at around 80 to 100 litres per day. And the evergreen species, Magnolia grandiflora and Pinus aletii, they actually tend to have greater resistance to water loss, and they're still using around 50 litres a day during that early summer period. So I think data like this, although you've got to be a bit cautious about applying it across a wide range of climates, is really instructive in telling us the sorts of volumes that landscape trees might use in our urban environments. Well, of course, the urban environment is full of challenges to the acquisition of water. Climatic drought, in the sense that lower than average rainfall, if you like, is only one of the elements that are responsible for driving water deficits in urban trees. Compaction is one of them. That compaction it interferes with infiltration into the soil. It also reduces the effective rooting volume of the tree and can be a major challenge to the acquisition of water. But we also have problems at transplanting with root to soil coupling. I call it root soil coupling. It's that those new roots getting out into that host soil that's really, really important for enabling the acquisition of water from the host soil. If those roots don't get out into the host soil, either through perhaps root defects in the root ball or difficult, challenging root environment conditions, then the acquisition of water is going to be really challenging. We think about impermeable surfaces, and you've only got to have a look at this site in southern Sweden to realize that it doesn't matter how much it rains in this environment. Actually, getting water to the roots is really compromised by those impermeable surfaces. Again, all those involved with transplanting trees recognize that process of transplanting from a field-grown situation in the nursery into the urban environment can result in a really significant loss of rooting area, and particularly the fine roots that are important for, say, the uptake of water. And we've only got to look at this as a sort of really great image from Johan Osberg that shows a car park that the trees around the fringe have got access to shared rooting volumes, certainly much larger rooting volumes, and those trees in the middle are really not doing well on the pretty impoverished rooting volumes they have. And you can see the difference in the performance of those trees. So, there's a whole suite of aspects of the urban landscape, the hard landscape, that makes it really challenging for trees to access water. Of course, not every tree species can cope with no soil like these figs growing on the wall in Hong Kong. They're pretty exceptional, although they give wonderful characteristics to the place. And they're great to see, although they're slightly challenging to manage. We can't expect many of our urban trees to cope with those sorts of conditions. So, we place trees in really challenging, in tough conditions, and if they could talk or perhaps gesticulate, this is what they'd be saying to us. Well, we perhaps better leave it there, but it's a hostile environment for trees, and we ought to recognize that. And across a whole wide range of studies, and I've just picked one out here, we get a typical mortality of about 30% during the establishment phase. And I really like this paper that was produced by Lara Roman and her colleagues regarding the establishment survival of residential trees in Sacramento County. They followed a cohort of trees for about 5 years, and over that time, they lost about 30% of that cohort that they planted as part of a planting initiative. And this is, I've just got some messages from the discussion that I think are relevant for our webinar today. So the Sacramento Tree Foundation may implement further changes, including planting a higher proportion of drought-tolerant trees, because it was the drought-tolerant trees that were performing most effectively and surviving. We observe survival for species with low water use demand. Drought-tolerant trees may be able to withstand irrigation neglect. It may be prudent for this program to plant more drought-tolerant trees. Climate-appropriate species selection influenced urban tree survival during the establishment phase. So, without even looking too hard, we see some clear drivers of establishment survival being closely linked with this water use, drought tolerance of the species in mind. And of course, when we look to the natural world, we see trees that are more than capable of surviving in really challenging conditions. This is a Larico pine growing in Corsica. An olive tree, of course, in the Mediterranean. They are very, very drought tolerant. We've got eucalyptus species here in central Australia, and the baobabs in western Madagascar. These are extremely tough, dry environments. So that we know that trees survive in dry conditions. The key for us is to try and understand how they cope with that limited water availability. So for me, there's really two main themes of that trees have, if you like, to adapt to limited water availability, and that is the avoidance of tree water deficit and the tolerance of water deficit, and avoidance and tolerance of stresses is a well-known sort of plant ecological concept. But I try to break this up a little bit more and apply it to trees specifically. Sorry. So one of the ways to avoid tree water deficits is to maximize the water acquisition. The other is to reduce water use. And we can perhaps put a little bit more flesh on those bones if we break down three key themes. We've got physiological, structural, and life cycle approaches. So to maximize water acquisition, trees can increase their hydraulic conductivity. They can make it easier for water to pass through the system. That helps, with the water uptake and flow through the root system and the stem xylem and so on. They can root really rather deeply, and there's some phenomenally deep rooting trees. Certainly, there's evidence of trees rooting 100 meters below the surface. So there's some incredibly deep rooting trees, and they can effectively decouple the precipitation that's hitting the surface if they can tap into underground aquifers or underground streams and underground water sources. And that's how many of these very dry land trees survive. But also, of course, root proliferation within a volume of soil will also likely increase the availability of water and help maximize that water acquisition. Well, trees can reduce water through stomatal closure, something that we're probably quite familiar with, as these pores in the surface of the leaves close under drying conditions. That reduces the water loss from the leaf. But we can also see reduced leaf and stem growth. The reduction in overall crown area reduces the water demand of the whole tree, and that's helpful for water conservation in the longer term. And they can, through changes in the surface topography and surface characteristics of the leaf, they can increase the resistance to leaf water loss. And then from a life cycle point of view, we have leaf phenology aspects. So I'm thinking here particularly of drought deciduous species that might be found in Mediterranean climates that lose their leaves in the most hot and dry periods. And then ultimately leaf abscission, where if trees get into trouble, they can just drop their leaves. And by doing so, they reduce the water demand from the crown, and they can help to increase the likelihood of survival of the remaining part of the tree. So they are perhaps a whole suite of adaptations that trees use to help them avoid the development of a tree water deficit in the first place. Perhaps they're more interesting from my point of view and from a tree selection point of view, are characteristics that help with the tolerance of water deficit. So this is an inherent tolerance to water deficit. And some of the things we'll be talking about a little bit more are the low turgor loss point that's derived ultimately through osmotic adjustment and increased resistance to drought-induced cavitation. So I suppose one of the messages, perhaps from a selection point of view, is to avoid avoiders for those challenging sites, because actually what you end up with is trees that look a bit like those in the images. The older there on the left, that's growing in my garden in a pot, and I went away for a few days when it was rather hot, and I came back to find it had basically just gone crispy. So there we are. What do I know about trees and drought? So that was quite interesting. But actually, towards the end of my period away, it did rain, and you can see new leaves emerging as it reinstates its hydraulic connectivity with the leaves and develops new leaves. Now, that's a great mechanism of survival, but it's not really what we want in our urban trees when we expect them to be in leaf for longer periods of time. We don't want them going crispy and then greening up, going crispy, then greening up. Equally, on the right there, the birch, this was the end of summer. There's no reason why that birch shouldn't be in full leaf, but it had lost all its leaves. You can clearly see the building straight through the tree. That shouldn't be happening because it's got this very restricted root volume. So it's, of course, any restriction in the rooting volume is going to accelerate any potential water deficit. And this is not what we want in our urban tree characteristics. So there are places for these trees in our urban environments, but they're not necessarily in those highly constrained sites. For those sites, we need a much better idea of tolerant trees. And I suppose what I would advocate is drought tolerance characteristics, because they have an inherent resilience to water deficits. They're able to extract water from the soil longer during a drying cycle. They're able to maintain physiological activity for longer. So for those all important ecosystem services, things like carbon gain, that's maintained for longer. Transpiration and evaporative cooling is maintained for longer. Whereas with those trees that are avoiding the water deficit, they shut down their stomata, they're not losing water from the leaves, so the benefit of any evaporative cooling is diminished. So ultimately, the drought-tolerant trees will perform better as landscape trees on challenging sites. And the example there is a lovely ginkgo growing in Malmö in southern Sweden. I think, Megan, if there are some questions on that first bit, we could tackle maybe one or two now.
I think everybody is just paying such close attention they haven't had time to type any questions.
Okay.
So.
Well, that's good. Well, we can keep going. No problem at all. So the question from all of that for me is, how can we select for drought tolerance as opposed to a drought avoidance? And that's one of the key themes of my research. Of course, one of the things that would be intuitive for anybody engaged with tree selection would be to look at the literature, take advice from the literature. And, there's a whole range of, dendrological references to kind of plant use books out there. But actually, when you interrogate that, it's rather confusing. So this is just a single species, Ace negundo. And the sorts of things you get related to the habitat in the literature. It's useful for sandy, dry to sterile soil. It's drought tolerant, but its native habitat is along streams and ponds, implying that it likes moist conditions. Native to moist habitats, but performs well also in poor, wet or dry habitats. Well, that's really hedging their bets. Very heat and drought tolerant, grows along shores of permanent bodies of water, likes humid areas, grows along stream banks, floodplains, swamps. So if you are perhaps less experienced with trees and perhaps don't come from a biological background, and you engage with that range of literature, it's quite difficult to resolve where that particular species might lie from a drought tolerance point of view. And that really makes the selection process rather opaque with regards to drought tolerance. So what I would like to do is try and improve selection decisions in relation to drought tolerance. Now, of course, drought tolerance is only one element, but we've seen from that case study of Lara Roman's work, and I'm sure many of your own experiences will bear this to be true, that actually drought tolerance really is an important characteristic of tree survivorship in that establishment phase, and actually going on to perform well as a mature tree in the landscape as well. So been looking at trait-based assessments, and what I mean by that is a quantifiable characteristic that reveals something of the tree's personality, if you like. So something about its character that we can measure. And to do that, we've looked at two different traits. The first is leaf turgor loss, and if you like, that's the permanent wilting point, the point at which it won't recover from wilting if you rewater. Ultimately, we've all probably abandoned house plants and they've wilted to the point of no return. So that's the point we're looking to identify, and we can measure that as a water potential. And the other trait that I briefly want to touch on today is the stem water potential at 50% loss of hydraulic conductivity, and we'll pick that up a bit later in the presentation. So the leaf turgor loss then is a really good thing to measure, because the leaf turgor point can be used, turgor loss point, sorry, can be used as a universal indicator of physiological drought tolerance. It's quantifiable, and it's measurable. And there's some really good work done by Megan Bartlett and her colleagues that have looked at the importance of this trait. And just on the right there, actually a Sorbus orchiperia, a rowan tree growing in southern Sweden. And it was clearly wilting when I visited the area, but the trees around it seem to be doing absolutely fine. So it's this contrast between different species turgor loss points that we're looking to identify and then use that to inform selection decisions. And the method, just briefly, I'm happy to sort of forward this on to really interested parties, is to assess the osmotic potential at full turgor, and we use that using an osmometer, and then we apply a regression, which is a relationship based on Megan Bartlett's work that provides a linear relationship between this osmotic potential at full turgor, so if you like how sugary the leaf is, its osmotic potential, and the turgor loss point. And that's a linear relationship, quite a good relationship. So we can then use that to help rank species in terms of their physiological drought tolerance. So one of the early and really rather instructive studies that we carried out is in collaboration with Henrik Hjalman of Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, Nina Bassuk at Cornell University. And we chose maples as a representative genre that we knew would have drought-sensitive species as well as drought-tolerant species. And we took the trees around Cornell that were growing in their collections that had unconstrained rooting conditions. And we measured the spring and the summer turgor loss point of those trees. And we found a really wide variation in drought tolerance according to their leaf turgor loss point. So just briefly then, looking at a few of those species, Acer spicatum then had a summer leaf turgor loss point of about minus 1.6 megapascals. So that's really quite high. In other words, it's quite drought sensitive. And when you look at this natural environment that it grows in, it's an understory species. It is associated with quite moist, damp places. And there's no real value for that to deliver significant drought tolerance. That's not where its habitat lies. So it consequently didn't have a very high turgor loss, sorry, it had a very low turgor loss point. It's difficult when you're talking about a negative scale, but it didn't have a very low turgor loss point. When we look at something like Acer truncatum, again, rather humid, understory conditions, this is taken in the Qingling Mountains in China, we find that it's minus 2.4 megapascals. At the other end of the spectrum, this is Acer tataricum, growing with Quercus pubescens in the steppe forest of eastern Romania, and a much, much drier, warmer, hotter climate, and we see its turgor loss point is minus 3.6 megapascals. And Acer grandidentatum in the Western Rockies there, minus 3.8 megapascals, and Acer montpessolanum was even more negative than that. And so we found these rather large differences, and even differences within Acer cultivars. So we looked at 3 Acer saccharum cultivars and 3 Acer rubrum cultivars. And we found we were able to resolve significant differences in the cultivars according to their leaf turgor loss point. And so that was really helpful because this is the sort of information that has got great practical applicability to real life selection decisions. And so if we were to look at this sort of urban planting scenario where we have a highly constrained site, a limited rooting volume and really no options for deep rooting, then we take this sort of scheme, if you like. The species that are towards the top end of the graph there, well, they're just never going to survive. They simply don't have the tolerance characteristics to be able to survive in those low rooting volumes and really rather challenging conditions. Whereas the species towards the lower end stand a much better chance of surviving. I'm not necessarily suggesting the species that I circled there would be appropriate, but I'm just saying in terms of the relative position in that range, those with a more negative turgor loss point are going to be much more suited to those challenging urban sites. And so the conclusions of that study were that wide variation in physiological drought tolerance across closely related species and cultivars could be observed. We think that leaf turgor loss point can be a very useful trait for screening and the selection of urban trees. Of course, there's lots more precise, if you like, analysis you could do with very controlled experiments. But to do that on mature trees would be, as Eric alluded to in his introduction, an extremely long-term experiment. So this is a very useful proxy, if you like, for getting some additional information that's valid and valuable for those that are selecting trees. And also, importantly, from my point of view, is that it provides evidence for nurseries who ultimately take a risk on introducing new species and cultivars to have some evidence that the species that they're bringing into cultivation and perhaps advocating for particular sites have got some merit, and they've got a kind of a robust measure that they can present their cultivars and species with. And I think that's important so that they don't start advocating inappropriate species. So that's a bit of the background, and really now that brings me to the point of my application to Tree Fund and wanting to drive this work forward. And so I engaged with a number of collections in the UK, particularly with one of them was Kew Gardens, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, and we did some work on a whole range of Tilia species, Fraxinus species, Oystria, and Carpenter species. And again, we found the summer turgor loss point to be quite variable. Again, if you kind of looking at this figure, they're ranked according to their summer turgor loss point. So the species appearing lower down the figure have got a more negative turgor loss point, and that's more drought tolerant. So we're picking up again in collections taken at the same time variation that we can then use to help inform our species selection. So we looked at a whole range of important temperate species there, and Nest Botanic Gardens on the Wirral near Liverpool in the northwest of the UK has a particularly good Betula collection, and so we looked at a whole range of Betula there. And it's quite important to be able to resolve these differences, because if you want a particular look, say, of a birch, then it might be that, from a layman's point of view, people can't tell the difference between Betula pendula and Betula lenta, but actually Betula lenta might deliver just that additional bit of drought tolerance and survivorship as a result. So it's important to try and resolve that. Of course, you would expect the birch to be at the rather sensitive end of the spectrum, and indeed they were. And so this collaboration with Henrik Hwarman, Nina Basic, and myself, and some others as well that have been involved with helping to collect the data, has kind of brought together a whole range of species. We have actually, I think, somewhere between 200 and 250 species now. And just to give you an idea of where some species sit in that, at the more sensitive end of the spectrum, we've got Aeschylus flava, magnolia. They're always rather sensitive, or at least most of the magnolias we've tested have been. Cicidophyllum japonicum, a little bit less sensitive, but still rather sensitive. Liriodendron, Chilipifera. These are getting more drought tolerant as I go through. Corylus, Tilia tomentosa, Gentii, Aces achense, Eucomia, Omoides, Quercus ceris, and we're getting now into the really rather drought-tolerant species, Pinus nigra, Ginkgo biloba, Syringa reticulata, Coleoteria paniculata. So I know I've whizzed through those, and I apologize for that, but ultimately what you see there is borne out in the experience of practitioners as well. We know that those that have got a more negative turgor loss point also are more drought tolerant in our experience as well. And so the picture of that part of the research so far is that we do get these significant differences between species turgor loss point. It's broadly consistent with what we would expect based on the tree's natural habitat, but it helps us differentiate between the species that might be trying to avoid drought through deep rooting, which is compromised in many urban situations, and those are actually inherently tolerant, and that's really key. And I think, as I say, it provides excellent promise as a tool to help screen species for selection. And there's been a whole range of people involved with that. I mentioned the 3 academic partners there, but Tree Fund have funded some of that work, Fund for Trees, and also NERC, a UK-based funder, has been involved with that. And just to try and formalize whether or not this Turgor loss point was actually bearing true in the real world, we did a survey that asked this question: based on your experience, categorize the following species according to their tolerance. And I gave a rather qualitative scale there, and I think there's about 20 species. And I asked, it was a group made up mainly of landscape architects, arboricultural consultants, and municipal tree officers, what their experience was of their species, and asked them only to answer if they felt they had good experience. And what we found was, if we took the practitioner experience and we then compared that with the leaf turgor loss point, there was this highly significant relationship. And so that gave us confidence that actually what we can do through a relatively simple screening tool actually will translate into a likely experience of practitioners. Okay, are there any questions on that, Megan?
Yes, there are a lot of questions, so okay. I'm just going to kind of go through. I'm going to read from the bottom up so that we can sort of get the most recent ones. So Astrid asked in the chat pod, which that's okay, Astrid, but how about drought-tolerant species that also show tolerance towards alternating conditions between drought and torrential rains and temporary flooding? Has there been any research on that subject as well?
Well, those species are really interesting. They're typically found in riparian environments, particularly adjacent to seasonal watercourses, where they have, there's fluctuations between flooding and drought. And there has been we are doing some work, and some of those species are represented in the analysis that we've done. Things like Catalpa ovata, I think, is one of them. Off the top of my head, there's some of the Fraxinus would fit into that sort of character, that sort of scheme as well. So there are those species, and yeah, typically they're found in the along watercourses that have got a very seasonal nature. But I do have a bit of a list I could send if she was interested.
Yep, a couple people have asked about species list recommendations. So yes, any information you could send would be appreciated. So another one, were the turgor loss point tolerances measured on one species individual or across several individuals? If several individuals were measured, were there significant differences within species or cultivars?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We tended to only use the trees species from the collections where we had 4, 5, 6 representatives. So there was replication in there across individual trees. Actually, broadly they were quite similar, but of course there is quite a significant seasonal variation in the leaf turgor loss point because it's driven by osmotic adjustment. So that is a potential pitfall of this technique, is not either accounting for the seasonal variation adequately or collecting data from trees that have never been pressured at all. So they haven't been placed in a position where they've had to, adapt to a summer, if you like. So it's not absolutely foolproof, but providing there has been some element of seasonal adjustment, then we're able to pick out these differences quite well. And in fact, just looking at the slide that's up there, you can see that the spring reading, which is in the light grey, actually bore no resemblance to the professional drought tolerance score. It's only when we have that pressure that summer brings that we get that sort of resolution.
So David asked, could some So could a generally deep-rooted tree also have a low turgor loss? Would it still struggle in a constrained space?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately trees tend to have either a very a tolerant strategy or avoidance strategy, and there can be some trees that are identified in very dry regions of the world, but actually what they're doing is they're avoiding the development of water deficits by deep rooting. So if you take that ability away, either through root severance in the nursery or placing them in podiums or containers or in urban environments where they haven't got that ability, then we can then see a sort of a problem with what we expect to be drought tolerant actually not performing as well as we would like, because their main ability to be able to survive drought is through the avoidance of drought via deep rooting. So that's one of the values of this type of approach, is it will account for that somewhat. Of course you could do a whole series of experiments to resolve that for every species, but if you're going to do that for 200-300 species, then of course that would be a decade's worth of work. So yeah, it is a compromise. But just to answer that, if a tree avoids drought through deep rooting and we place that in an urban environment, we may well be surprised by its lack of performance because it's not able to effectively deliver that strategy.
Good deal. I'm going to let you move on, Andrew, and I'll try and summarize some of these for your next break.
Okay, great. So just briefly then, I want to talk about two of the main drivers of tree mortality, particularly the hydraulic failure on the right there. But just briefly, there are two main drivers of tree mortality: carbon starvation, and that is where ultimately the carbon pool gets diminished over time and it runs out of carbon for respiration and energy and all those sorts of things. That's one major driver of tree mortality. The other is hydraulic failure, and that's where we have a gradual loss of hydraulic conductivity, and that's represented by percentage loss of hydraulic conductivity. So as that increases, so as it becomes more challenging for the roots to deliver water to the crown, then you get hydraulic failure, and that's a really important driver of tree mortality. Now, of course, I'm sure lots of you think, well, that's way more reasons than that why trees die, but actually most of them are associated with that. We have what I've referred to as accelerating agents. So they can either be biotic or abiotic. So for example, biotic agents that might accelerate percentage loss of conductivity would be wood boring beetles or fungi that in some way disrupt the xylem pathway and actually accelerate that loss of hydraulic conductivity. Of course, abiotic conditions, drought stress, will accelerate that loss of hydraulic conductivity to a point, and again, this is all quantifiable, whereby the tree enters a critical threshold by which it can't recover from that loss of hydraulic conductivity. And ecologists particularly have used a measure called the P50, so the water potential at 50% loss of hydraulic conductivity as a measure of drought tolerance. So again, it's a quantifiable measure of drought tolerance that's, if you like, an analogous measure that's occurring within the stem rather than within the leaf. And that varies hugely between species. So the P50 varies from 0.7 to an astonishing minus 18.8 in the literature. And then the P88, I've got a critical threshold there, somewhere between that P50 and the P88. So at the 88% loss of hydraulic conductivity, we reach a critical threshold whereby the tree can't deliver water to its leaves and it dies through hydraulic failure. There is, of course, a degree of interdependency. If you've got sugars being transported around the tree via a sugary solution in the phloem, then of course the water relations are going to affect the carbon relations. So I can't really spend much more time on this model, but I hope that you've got the idea that you've got these two major drivers of tree mortality. that percentage loss of hydraulic conductivity is driven by embolism. So as we get less and less water available to the roots, the tensions within the xylem of the water increase. I should say they become more negative. So it's a bit like stretching an elastic band. As you gradually stretch that, you increase the tension. And at a certain point that is species specific, air gets sucked in to the xylem vessel elements or the tracheids, and that causes an embolism, and that effectively blocks that hydraulic pathway. And that's what's happening. Imagine you're at home drinking a beer and you've got 10 straws in that beer, and one of those straws gets blocked up. You've lost 10% of your hydraulic conductivity, and 20% all the way to 5 straws go, and you've lost 50%. Other things being equal, suction force and all that side of things. So you see, gradually, as these trachea elements, so the transport elements, the xylem vessels or tracheids, get embolized, we lose this hydraulic conductivity within the stem, and ultimately the ability for water to be delivered from the roots to the crown. So that's what's driving the loss of hydraulic conductivity. And in a really widely cited paper that evaluated 226 species from 81 sites across the world, we see a very drought-tolerant juniperus having a 50% loss of hydraulic conductivity at about -7 megapascals. And then at the other end of the spectrum, a very, very sensitive species that was around -1 megapascal. So we can see that these curves, if you like, this gradual decline in hydraulic conductivity with a decline in water potential are very, very different. And that gives us something to analyze to determine specific drought tolerance characteristics. And so I've been working with Hervé Cochard, based at an INRA lab in France. He's an expert in this field. And we've begun to start analyzing some amenity trees and their vulnerability to embolism. And this is Cytophyllum japonicum. It's a relatively sensitive species, if you remember from the previous analysis. And we see that the P50, so that's a 50% loss of hydraulic conductivity, is about -2.1 megapascals. And then around -2.5 megapascals, we can say, well, that tree is pretty much going to die. It can't cope beyond that level. And this is really useful information because it then allows us to look at the soil matrix potential, and from that the sort of likely soil water content, and say, well, how dry does the soil need to be before we start seeing these significant embolism events? Just briefly then, the P12, which is at the slightly wetter end of the spectrum, so less negative water potential, that's the point at which we typically begin to see embolisms starting to form within the xylem. So at the other end of the spectrum, at least amongst the ones that we analyze in terms of amenity trees, we've got something like Eucommia almoides, which is around -3.8 megapascals for the P50 and around -6 megapascals for that kind of really serious P88. So we see, this sort of analysis can be highly instructive and can be fed then into our selection decisions. Of course, whether or not you get a full grasp of some of those scientific concepts probably depends a bit on your background, and I know I've talked quite quickly through that. But the reality of high percentage loss of conductivity is dieback. That's what we see. What we see in dieback is trees trying to reduce the length of their hydraulic pathways, trying to restrict the size and development of their crown, so that there's less water demand from the crown of the roots. And ultimately, we see dieback where those embolisms continue to be problematic. So that's, if you like, some of the mechanistic ideas behind what we might observe in a declining tree. And so I know there's a priority of Tree Fund, and actually I've got some funding and collaborating with Trees and Design Action Group and Lancaster University and some NERC sponsorship to develop some of the science, if you like, into guidance. My major project at the moment is to write guidance on about 300 species that actually incorporates, wherever possible, this sort of trait data into it. So we're going to have a scale, a 4-point scale that says tolerant to drought, moderately tolerant to drought, moderately sensitive to drought, or sensitive to drought. And where we've got trait data, I've used that to inform that qualitative term, if you like. And so what we try and do is not make it highly technical for the landscape architect or the practitioner to understand. So without putting leaf turgor loss points in or vulnerability curve data in precisely, what we've chosen to do is to allocate particular ranges of those characteristics to inform a particular qualitative statement. So that's just one example of how we can use this sort of data, and then ultimately we're putting all these profiles together that will talk about the drought tolerance, but also a number of other environmental tolerances as well. And so that's a really good example, I think, of how we can translate some of this fundamental research into something that's really useful for the practitioner.
Quick question, Andrew.
Yeah.
Can this information be used in situations where the local soil conditions become drought-like due to salinity, due to road salt?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. The turgor loss point, of course, is ultimately driven by the osmotic potential at full turgor, and salts and so on are related, have a very strong influence on the osmotic content of the soil, and therefore the ability of the tree to uptake water. So there will be some relationship there. I don't think it's been precisely tested whether some of these species that show very strong osmotic adjustment characteristics are also tolerant to saline soils, so to say. It would be an interesting study to do. I expect it's not quite that simple, because you also get specific ion toxicity playing a part in saline soils and so on as well. But there may be some relationship there, but I'm not aware of it being systematically tested. But a good question.
And everybody's asking about where they can find this list. So,
okay, yeah. So it's not yet published, but it will be published, all things being equal, around Easter next year via the Trees and Design Action Group, which are a really interesting group that represent a whole range of professionals in the urban forestry, green infrastructure sort of sector. It's based in the UK, but it does have international relevance. So you can Google Trees and Design Action Group, and I'm sure I can try and share it quite widely. But as I say, we're still just developing that and reviewing the evidence and so on.
Great, go for it.
Okay. So yeah, one of my last slides then is to just try and pick up on some practical strategies for managing soil water availability. The first is to maximize the volume of soils that roots have access to. Small volumes of soil have the effect of accelerating any potential water deficit because, simply the tree uses that water more quickly in a small volume of soil. And about some of the other webinars that Tree Fund have delivered historically, I'm thinking particularly of Brian Scharenbrock's and Susan Day's webinars that are available for you to look at, actually talk quite a lot about improving rooting environments and dealing with compaction and so on. And so, if you think there are opportunities to maximize soil volume, please do engage with those webinars as well, because they really give some good practical advice as well. But yeah, so maximize the soil volume where possible, improve the soil water holding capacity where possible, and you can do that with the ameliorating the soil with organic matter, for example. Understand the water release characteristics of the soil. I haven't had an opportunity to really talk about that, but the relationship between the soil water potential and the soil water content is really, really important, and it varies from texture to texture. So it's important to understand that. But unfortunately, I just didn't have time to explore that in detail here. Reduced soil evaporation and other competition from vegetation. Of course, one of the major ways we can do that is via mulching. To also ensure that water that is being applied gets to the roots. And this is really critical. You know, there's no good just turning on the tap and watching your water run off down the path, so to say. What you need to do is ensure the water is being delivered and applied to the roots. And you know, there are various, you know, approaches that can aid you in doing that. But look at strategies which actually make sure that you get water to the roots and not just the soil surrounding the roots or the surface of the soil. Decide on the timing of irrigation based on the tree's water requirement. Again, that involves a little bit more physiology, but it's really important that you can apply water when the tree needs it, because that helps to avoid over application of water. And that can be really problematic because, of course, really the problem isn't so much too much water, it's not enough oxygen, because the water then replaces oxygen in the air spaces within the soil. And that becomes very problematic for root respiration and some other things. And then linking actually to that question, ensure the osmotic potential of the soil does not hinder root absorption is another way. And that's particularly important where you have lots of salts that end up in the soil. So I think we're probably close to the time allowance for this seminar. So I just wanted that to end on those practical strategies. And finally, as luck would have it, in about a week or so, I'm releasing a book that I co-authored with Peter Thomas from Keele University in the UK. And it's got chapters on, you know, the wood and woody skeleton, tree growth, leaves and crowns, tree roots, sort of seeds and planting, water relations, carbon relations, tree nutritions, interactions with other organisms, and particularly relevant for our seminar today, environmental challenges for trees, where I talk about drought, but also flooding and cold tolerance and so on as well. So that is available for pre-order on all good bookstores, I should say, shouldn't I? It should be out at the latest by January, but I've heard that it's probably going to be out by middle of December. So if you're interested in this field and the application of biology to practice, then I hope that will be really useful for you. I've just put the references there for you that I cited during the course of this presentation. You can't probably jot them all down now, but if you watch it back and hit pause, then you'll be able to get the details on that. So I suppose now simply to say, well, thanks for your time. Can be here for a little bit longer if you'd like to ask some questions. I hope that we won't be here till midnight, but in the UK, I don't know what time that'll be with you, but yeah, I'd love to take some questions and leave you all looking at one of the wonderful trees of the world, which is that baobab in Madagascar.
Great, Andrew. We had a couple questions on structural soils. Can you talk about your thoughts on using those for reducing soil compaction and all of the other benefits?
Yeah, I mean, structural soils have been shown quite nicely to reduce the soil strength, so they deliver rootable soil volumes. I think the danger with some structural soils, and the problem with talking about structural soils, is they're hugely variable. So one structural soil is not the same as another structural soil, but some of the potential problems are that there's actually not much in those soils that hold on to water. So you need much larger volumes of soil to deliver the same amount of water for the tree. Having said that, they're good from an aeration point of view. I suppose in an ideal world, I would think that maximizing volumes of actual soil, good quality soil, is probably more favorable than structural soils, but they're absolutely critical part of our toolkit, if you like, for dealing with rooting environments in urban conditions and hard landscapes. The danger, I suppose the danger is they dry out very rapidly. They don't hold on to water very effectively because they're largely sand and gravel based. And the same would also be true probably of nutrients. So while some trees are really rather well adapted at coping with those sorts of conditions, you might find some trees really struggling because those water deficits accelerate quite rapidly. But it all depends on, how rapidly you can recharge the soil water. So, structural soils that are linked up to, drainage from local roofs, for example, that might get irrigated through that mechanism have been used quite effectively. It's difficult to answer sort of more specifically than that, but clearly there are problems with the water holding capacity of structural soils when compared with what we might consider to be a more kind of classic loamy brown earth forest soil.
That leads me to my next question, but before I ask that one, before we lose too many other folks, I'm going to ask Mark to launch our poll. If you would mind taking a couple seconds to fill out our couple question poll, that helps us do our job better at Utah State University. And I'm going to ask my next question about biochar. Can you talk about your thoughts on biochar and what you might think, if that plays a role in what you have to say today?
Well, to be honest, I haven't looked closely at the water characteristics of biochar. I know the biochar advocates would certainly rate it, and there have been some really positive studies done with biochar. And one of the things to really look at would be to try and get the difference in the water release characteristics of a soil augmented with biochar, compare that with the soil that's not been augmented. And if you could get those two different curves, if you like, then you could really begin to assess the value of biochar, because biochar may be acting on a number of different levels. It may be that it helps with nutrient retention, or at least reducing leaching of nutrients, and that may encourage fine root development. So then you'd have to try and separate the increased rooting area for uptake from the actual conditions of water being held within the soil. So I certainly wouldn't rule out biochar. I know biochar has been used extremely effectively in the Stockholm system of like a skeleton soil, which is a very sort of large rocky aggregate, and biochar has been used effectively in those conditions, as well as in combination with irrigation and fertigation. So I think biochar has actually got a really important role to play. It's something worth looking at, but I'm not, off the top of my head, I'm not sure what the contrast in water release characteristics might be between a biochar and a non-biochar soil.
All right. What are your thoughts on using watering bags?
Yeah, I think, that's one of the strategies which can be useful for helping deliver water to the roots and not seeing that water run off across the surface, for example. I think providing they're used effectively, they're removed when they're not being used, and some sites, they may be problematic with vandalism and people sticking knives in them or just kind of pulling them off or whatever. But certainly for establishing trees, that relatively large volume of water that's delivered slowly around the actual root ball can be very effective.
Great. Will your tree list have USDA hardiness zones in it?
No, it's really meant for the UK primarily. That's where the kind of the money to translate the research in this has come from. So you can assume they're okay for the UK, but if it's a effective model and people want to see similar guidance for other regions, then maybe that's something we can think of in the future.
Great. There's a couple more specific questions. I might bounce around a little bit. I apologize. What size trees were used for the water demand of landscape trees research in Florida?
The Richard Beeston's work. It was, I think they were the graphs I showed anyway were between 10 and 15 centimeters diameter at the base. So obviously it varied through the year as the trees grew. but they're all in that region.
Great. This might be a little too specific for your expertise, but are there any comparisons with the most drought tolerant and invasive tree species? She's Patricia Greenberg was thinking specifically about the golden rain tree, which is invasive in the Mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, I mean, the Coleoteria there is invasive in the warm, temperate to sort of Mediterranean type climates. We don't find it invasive in the cooler climates, so in the UK or kind of southern Sweden, those sorts of areas. It's not really considered invasive, but it is problematic in those warmer environments. So that is something to be careful of, for sure. Of course, one of the reasons it's so successful is because it's drought tolerant. So there is clearly a link there. But not every drought tolerant tree will have such invasive characteristics. But that's an important point to note. And in fact, when we're writing up the guidance that's to be used in the UK, we do note whether there has been problems in particularly in warmer climates with invasiveness. And species like Robinia pseudoacacia would also come into that category.
Marianne asked, how did you qualify amenity tree?
Yeah, interesting. I suppose trees that are used extensively in the urban landscape rather than sort of, perhaps dominating forest environments or forestry situations. But it's a fairly, I don't think I've qualified that very precisely.
Okay. A couple people have asked about your thoughts on the use of water retention soil polymers.
Well, I think some of them can be quite effective. I think that they wouldn't be my first port of call, I suppose. I think, the first thing to do is try and maximize the root volume of uncompacted. So by uncompacted, typically a bulk density of less than 1.2 grams per cubic centimeter, and maximize that, incorporate mulch and those other elements as a priority first, because there's no point putting kind of polymers in a really restricted rooting volume. You just kind of, it's the wrong approach. So if we can try and expand rooting volumes, plan and design large rooting volumes, then that will be my priority. If in terms of the question, I think again it comes down to the water release characteristics. What you don't want to do is to have a polymer that will hold on to water more tightly than the tree can extract it from the soil, if that makes sense. So the tree's got a limited ability to draw water from the soil that's going to be determined by characteristics, such as a leaf turgor loss point. And you don't want the polymer to be holding on to water more tightly than the tree is able to extract it. So that is a danger. But again, it's a bit like structural soils. Without, having particular products and doing those testing, I think the variation in the commercial products is quite high. So I wouldn't want to make a sort of generic statement that they're bad or good, but they're certainly something to be cautious of, and they wouldn't be my first approach in managing water deficits in trees.
Great. Bruce asked, does the planting bed in Ithaca contribute to root, soil bore, and vascular wilt, for example, verticulum?
Well, pathology is not my strong point. All I would say is that clearly abiotic stress makes trees more vulnerable to biological pathogens. So where you have those highly constrained conditions that trees will be challenged in, that will make them more vulnerable, not just to rooting pathogens, but also to insect pathogens and so on. And yeah, we see that's one of the reasons why we see a particular association with drought and insect infestations when you go to more forested landscapes.
Something we're dealing with definitely here.
Yeah.
Have you arrived at an absolute turgor loss point yet based on published and unpublished data, or would this be based on the species mean, say, within the genus Acer? Ryan asked that question.
Yeah, in terms of the absolute turgor loss point, I think you would need to do quite a precisely designed experiment with known rooting volumes, known irrigation regimes, and monitoring, decline in water potential and some other characteristics much more precisely. So I wouldn't say that the data that I've shared and that we've published to date represents absolute values, but what it does do is help resolve, what end of the spectrum species might sit, where they're sensitive, tolerant, or in some way moderate. And as I said earlier, or certainly implied earlier, where we have a greater pressure, some trees have shown greater plasticity in their ability to adapt than other trees, and that's that's another bit of research, and that's something we're certainly interested in. But the sort of early part of our research theme was really to try and get an idea of a broad range of species, and then we'll perhaps focus in on some of those specific questions. But to get an absolute leaf turgor loss point, would require quite highly designed experiments, which then you obviously reduce the number of species that you can evaluate. So it's a compromise between getting some useful information and finding something that's absolute. I liken it, I suppose, if I was to walk down the street with Usain Bolt, or walk in the woods with Usain Bolt, I could probably keep up with him while I was walking. But if a bear was chasing us, I'd be the one that was lunch, because as soon as that pressure comes, he'd just accelerate away. So you have some trees that kind of can maintain that walking pace. You don't see the differences resolved until you get that stress, that pressure, and then you see them really apparently. And I think that's one of the questions that is a really interesting thing to tackle, which is another reasons why we want to look at the vulnerability of the stem to embolism, those vulnerability curves, because that vulnerability is based on anatomical characteristics, the characteristics of the bordered pits and the pit membranes. That's actually much more defined. It's much less plastic, so we can expect to get a more consistent result across, without having this kind of physiological adaptation and so on into the mix. So that's a much more fixed trait, if you like. It gives really excellent information, but one of the things I would say, it is a bit more time consuming to collect. So it's all about, getting information, but if you just spend a year focusing on one species, you might have that single species really well evaluated, but that's less valuable from a selection and a kind of driving urban forest diversity, urban forest resilience point of view.
That seems kind of like a great place to stop, but I'm open to facilitating more questions or ending it here. What's up? It's up to you, Andrew. What do you think?
Yeah, I left my email address on the bottom of that final page, so people have really got something burning that they think I can help with, they can certainly email me. I think also, if you found this seminar useful and you think the research is valuable, please do let Tree Fund know so that they can incorporate your feelings into future bidding rounds, and share your thoughts with me. I'm more than happy to kind of field a few questions via email if that's helpful. And just lastly, if we're going to wrap it up here, thanks once again to Tree Fund for helping to promote this research, but also of course fund a good portion of it in the first place. I'm excited to continue this work, and hopefully there will be updates in the future along the same theme.
Andrew, would you be willing to send me your slideshow so I can put it on our website so people can view it and download it if they want to? Because sometimes people have been emailing that asking.
Yeah, I might take a few slides out that have got data that we haven't yet published in, but other than that,
okay,
sure.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Our next webinar is just in under a week, Tuesday, December 5th. Please join us and check out our website for more details about that webinar. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Mark. And please remember to take the quick couple question poll that Mark pulled up for all of you to help us evaluate our program. And everybody have a good rest of your day or evening. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Bye.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.